Okay, and welcome to Principles of Micro with James Bland. Today I'm going to be teaching you about taxation and deadweight loss. Okay, the takeaway from this class is that governments are bad, but I want you to remember that this is a takeaway that only works in a certain set of circumstances. And specifically, we might need to jump ahead a little bit, but the one we would need to worry about is whether we have externalities. Okay, and so the takeaway from this class is if we don't have any externalities, if the government taxes a market, there's going to be a deadweight loss. Okay, a deadweight loss meaning that total surplus is not as large as it could have been if the government had not taxed the market. Okay, now if there is an externality present, specifically a negative externality, or if the government is in a position to spend revenue in a way that is welfare improving, then the government may still want to tax people or tax markets. In fact, people might want to have these markets be taxed because they would be better off because the government is in a better position to spend money on certain projects than individual people are themselves. Okay, so we're going to keep maintaining this assumption that we have no externalities and essentially see what happens to total welfare in this situation when the government taxes a market. Okay, so here we're just going to review stuff we did in chapter 6 to begin with. So I'm working through Mankew's Principles of Micro, so that's where the chapter 6 is, to see what happens to begin with when a government taxes a market. Okay, so here's our supply and demand diagram. We've got supply and demand, and without a tax, this is where we end up. Okay, we have an equilibrium price and quantity, and importantly here, for this price, this is equal to the price that consumers pay and the price sellers receive because the government isn't taking anything out of the middle. Okay, so let's see what happens when the government imposes a tax, and we're not going to do this as a shift or supply and demand, we're just going to draw this as a tax wedge. The government taxes the market by this much. Okay, so if the government taxes the market by that much, we have, the price consumers pay is up here. The price sellers receive is down here. And this is our quantity with the tax. Okay, so this is where we, mainly where we finished up in chapter 6, and so we're going to bring in our concepts of consumer surplus and producer surplus and total surplus into this environment. So just to review consumer and producer surplus, I'm going to draw a couple of, supply and demand diagrams here, if the thing will let me. There we go. So, just to review what consumer and producer surplus are, here is a demand curve, here is a supply curve, and if we've got a particular price here, suppose this is the price consumers pay, well, if consumers are paying this much, and the demand curve here represents a consumer's marginal value at each point, And so there's a consumer here that gets this value but only has to pay this much, and so this is their total benefit, or their net benefit, sorry, from buying the good. And so consumer surplus, if we add up all of these benefits, is going to be the area between the price consumers pay and the demand curve to the left of the quantity that's purchased. Okay, so here's our consumer surplus there. Let's label that. Okay, and to do the same thing with the supply side, let's say this is the price sellers receive. Don't look at these diagrams next to each other, they aren't meaning much at the moment. Okay, if we think about this, we've got a seller here on the supply curve with, this is their marginal cost, so it costs them this much to produce this item, but they get to sell it for this much. So they're getting this net benefit here, this height. Okay, so if we add up all of these net benefits that sellers are getting from selling their item, well, the benefit they get, the marginal benefit they get, is going to be the price that sellers receive, right? For every item they sell, they get this much of a benefit. And what are they giving up to get that benefit? Well, that's their marginal costs. So we're going to measure producer surplus by the area between the supply curve and the price sellers receive. Okay, so now let's put this together in a diagram, a supply and demand diagram with a tax. Okay. Okay, here's supply, here's demand, and actually I'm going to draw these a little bit flatter just so I've got more to work with. Here's supply and here's demand. Okay, and so before we impose a tax, here's our equilibrium quantity. Here is our equilibrium price, which is the price consumers pay and the price that sellers receive. Okay, and then we are going to implement a tax that drives a wedge between supply and demand, equal to the value of the tax. Okay, so the height there is the tax, and so here is the quantity traded with the tax. Here is the price consumers pay, and here is the price sellers receive. Okay, now I see a whole lot of areas on this graph that could be relevant. Okay, so what we're going to do here now is to label the areas and to work out which bits of these areas are consumer and producer surplus and total surplus and so on. Okay, so what I want you to do when you see these graphs is to think about all of these horizontal and vertical lines, like say this one and this one and this one. Think about how your graph is divided up by these horizontal and vertical lines. Okay, and so for every area that's divided up by these lines, we're going to label that with a letter. Okay, so we're going to call this A, B, C, D, E, F. I'm going to label these here G and H. Actually, G is a bad one, so I'm going to call these H and I. G is going to be government revenue at some point. But I know these two aren't going to be part of the equation. Okay, so we're going to think about what is surplus for consumers and producers before the tax and after the tax. Okay, so I'm going to zoom out a little bit here so I can do this. Let's get a table going. Okay, so we have before the tax, and we can have consumer surplus and producer surplus. Actually, I need a bit more space here. Okay, so before the tax, consumer surplus is going to be the area between the price consumers pay, which in this situation is the equilibrium price, and the demand curve to the left of the quantity being traded, which is Q star. Okay, so this area here within this yellow triangle is consumer surplus, which if we're thinking about that as areas, that's going to be A, B, and E. All right, we've got areas A plus B plus E. Okay, now let's think about producer surplus. Let's go to green. Producer surplus is going to be the area between the supply curve and the price that sellers receive, which again is P star because we don't have a tax. Okay, so this is producer surplus. And in terms of the letters, we've got C, D, and F. C plus D plus F. Okay, so that's what happens before the tax. Well, what about after the tax? Okay, so another color here. Consumer surplus is always going to be defined as the area between the price consumers pay and the demand curve to the left of the quantity that's traded. Okay, so think about this as marginal benefit, that's how much do consumers get from buying the good, minus how much did they give up to get the good, which is now the price consumers pay. Okay, so now we're interested in this area here, which is our new consumer surplus. Okay, and that area is just A. Sorry, I should shade that. That's our A. And similarly for producer surplus, well, that producers are receiving, the sellers are receiving a lower price and they're selling less stuff. So now they're only getting this area in here. Okay. And so producer surplus here is just area D. Okay. Now, let's have a think about how much better or worse off consumers and producers are, right? So before the tax, consumers got areas A, B, and E, right? That's the yellow area here that we had when consumers were trading at P star, okay? But after the tax, they're only getting A, so they're worse off by B and E. Okay. What about producers? Okay, well, beforehand, they got the green triangle in producer surplus, but then the price sellers received went down, and so their surplus went down, right? Well, how much did it go down by? Well, we got D in both of these situations, but what they're missing out on is C and F, right? So they're worse off by C, and they're worse off by F. Okay. Okay, so at this point, we've worked out something that we've known before, you know, something that we worked out already in Chapter 6, which was that consumers are worse off and producers are worse off, right? Consumers are paying more and buying less, so that's not good for them. And producers are selling less and receiving less for what they're selling, so that's bad. The thing is here, though, is that we have a third group or third entity in this market now, and that's the government. Okay, that's why I didn't want to use G before. Okay, so if we think about this before the tax, right, when there was no tax, the government wasn't collecting anything. We need to work out, well, what is government revenue when the government taxes the market? Okay, so what color have I not used yet? Let's use red. No, I've already got red. Brown. Okay, so the government collects T dollars for every item that is sold in the market, right? And well, how much is sold when they impose the tax? It's not Q star, it's QT. Okay, so the government collects this quantity and this quantity is sold, and the government collects this much per item. So the government is collecting this area here. That's not a highlighter, so I'm just going to have to draw it like this. That area there as revenue. Okay, so the government has collected areas B plus C. Okay, so here the government is better off by B plus C, right? They have more revenue than they had before, but consumers are worse off by B and E, and producers are worse off by C and F. Okay, so if we think about this, what's happened, and I'll go to a different color here, what's happened is that we've transferred B from consumers to the government, and we've transferred C, right? C was surplus that producers got before the tax and is now government revenue. And what doesn't show up here in the total surplus after the tax is either E or F, right? So here we've got total surplus is going to be A plus B plus C plus D plus E plus F. And so after the tax, total surplus is just A plus B plus C plus D, and that's it, right? A, B, C, D. Good. Okay, so the change here is that we've lost E and F. Okay, so this change here in total surplus, right? Because we've got three groups now. We've got consumer surplus, we've got producer surplus, and we've got government revenue. We're going to assume that government revenue is spent on something that generates benefit to society, so we're not just going to ignore government revenue. Maybe they hire some more police officers or fund a new school or something like that. But what we're worried about here is E and F is some surplus that we got in equilibrium without the tax, and that's this area here. E and F is an area that we got in equilibrium without the tax that we did not get when we had the tax. Okay, so this area is referred to as the deadweight loss. Whoops, not with a B. And sometimes in my notes I'll just refer to this as DWL because it takes a while to write. And this is the total surplus that we lose by taxing the market. So if we think about this, if the government wants to raise revenue by taxing this market, they can do it. And they're going to get areas B plus C as revenue. But what they've done is imposed this cost on society of E plus F. Okay, so the government can raise revenue, but it doesn't raise as much revenue as consumer and producer surplus goes down by, right? Consumer surplus and producer surplus go down by B, E, C, and F, and government revenue only goes up by B and C. Okay? So what this tells us that in this situation, as taxes go up, total surplus goes down. Okay. Now remember, at the start of this class, I said there was a big if here and that we had no externalities, and also maybe the government can spend this money in a way that improves surplus more than E plus F, but that's outside of this market. Okay, consumers and producers are worse off by more than the amount of money that the government has collected. Okay, so this is referred to as, the deadweight loss of taxation, and it's this area here, in this triangle, this red triangle here to the right. If we think about this, these are trades that didn't happen, right? Everything along here, right, before we got Q star in equilibrium, and then after the tax we only got QT. And so what's happened here is the government has ruled out all of the trades that are less valuable than the value of the tax. So for instance, suppose that I'm a seller and I can sell something for $1, like that's my marginal cost, and you want to buy something for $3. Between us we have a gains from trade of $2, right? You value it at $3. I can sell it, I can produce it for $1, so there's $2 of benefit if we trade. The price is really just deciding who gets which parts of that benefit. Okay? But if the government taxes the market by $2, then we have no benefits from trade. And if we do trade, we're just as well off as if we hadn't traded. And if the government taxes more than that, then we definitely won't want to trade, right? We're strictly better off than had we, if we had not traded. Okay, so what the government is doing when they tax a market is they rule out the lowest value trades, but these trades still have value to society, right? So we're still sort of achieving the production and allocative efficiency goals of the market, right? We're still getting the goods produced by the sellers with the lowest costs, and we're still allocating those goods to the buyers with the highest values, but we're not getting the quantity right? The quantity that maximizes total surplus is over here, and we've reduced the quantity, right? We've ruled out some trades that are beneficial to society, and that's why there is a cost of taxation. Please hang around at least until Chapter 10, where we talk about externalities, because the government can actually do some good in some other situations. I'm James Bland. This is Principles of Micro. Thanks very much, and I'll see you later.